Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast. And we have a returning guest who's, I think, been on the show. This is the third time. But the last time he was on, which was in June last year, so June 2022, episode 248. So we have Anthony Marwiski, who's the chairman of Nickel 28, who are an innovative battery metals focused investment vehicle with a focus on metal streaming and royalty agreements, offering investors exposure to metal and key technologies of the electric vehicle and energy storage markets. Anthony's an entrepreneur, investor, and speculator, and he's going to give us an update on Nickel 28, talk about market conditions, and much more. So that's welcome Anthony to the podcast. How you doing, Anthony?
Great. Hey, thanks a lot for having me back. I really appreciate it and always enjoy catching up. So yeah, I mean, look, it's a new year. And it's feeling pretty bouncy for commodities, I would say. I don't know. I think a lot of your guests have echoed that. Inflation is always, historically, it's always been a great moment for commodities. And I think you're seeing that with investor interest and commodity prices alike. So it looks to be a pretty good year this year.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. So for those that haven't listened to your previous episode, I just wondered if you can give us a quick snapshot of yourself and your career.
Yeah, so I spent my career, at least the first part of it, at a hedge fund and later a private equity firm focused on metals and mining and natural resources, and then ultimately spun out to focus on really the green energy transition that's underway globally, whether that's to electric vehicles or just the transition of our energy grids, or thinking about things like nuclear energy. And the company that my partner and I founded is called Nickel 28. And, that is one of the largest producers of MHP in the world. MHP, mixed hydroxide, is a type of nickel that goes into a lot of batteries and a lot of these electrification kind of technologies. And so, what we do is really act as a conduit for investors to get exposure to the adoption of not just electric vehicles, but a bunch of these technologies that are hopefully changing the way that we consume power. So that's the kind of the short and long of what we're up to.
Yeah. So just wanted to give us a overview of Nickel 28 and an update since we last spoke.
Yeah, sure. So Nickel 28, just to kind of remind the audience, we own 8.5% going to 11.5%. The Ramu nickel mine in Papua New Guinea. I've been producing now for over 7 years. And when we built that mine, we took construction debt and from our partner, and we've been paying it down from the proceeds of the sale of the nickel and the cobalt. And now we're kind of in the home stretch here, another year, depending on the price of nickel and production rates, and that debt is paid down. And then we'll be, a massively cash generative vehicle, and we're going to return that capital. We're going to have a big dividend, hopefully, and really be unique in that way, as opposed to growing through acquisitions and doing this type of stuff. I think at this time, the most interesting thing is it's going to be return that capital to shareholders. So, I think what's different from the last time we were on here is there's more interest in commodities, and we're just that much closer to having repaid the debt. And I think we're often asked, how long is that going to take? And it's really a product of the nickel price. So, the higher the nickel price, the higher the payabilities, the faster that debt is repaid.
Obviously, you're in the battery metal space. How are you seeing the sector develop if you were looking at last year going into this year?
Well, clearly lithium has been a huge winner, right? I mean, the whole space has just continued to go harder and longer than I anticipated. I mean, I didn't foresee that it would do what it did. I think, the other one is probably copper. People have been talking about copper now for years, but it feels like we're really at this inflection moment where copper is going to become more interesting. And people I would categorize uranium as a battery metal, simply because how do you charge these cars? Right now, a lot of the base load is coal globally. Look at China, US. There's a lot of coal that gets burned globally, and it's one thing to talk about your electric vehicle, but then you got to move down the value chain and be realistic about where that power comes from. And so I think that as part of this next century power grid and thinking about emissions, uranium ends up also being really interesting.
What's happening in the carbon market since we last spoke? And I
Yeah,
suppose
so
how is the carbon market developing itself? Because obviously it seems to be still relatively new to the industry.
yeah, so the carbon market overall, it's an interesting one. So the actual demand from corporates continues to grow, and more companies have kind of piled in and bought those credits. I think the public narrative, whether it's a negative Guardian article or the Wall Street Journal, who both seem to be pretty negative on these credits, I think that's impacted investor sentiment. And so the performance of, I think, nearly every publicly traded carbon company that I'm aware of is down. And I don't think that reflects the reality of the demand. And so, at some point, whether it's sometime this year or next year, I think the investor market kind of comes around to see that it's real. If you look at carbon streaming, a big moment for them is going to be when they sell their credits. They've got all these credits from RIMBA. So I think when you have someone like a carbon streaming sell those credits this year, then it kind of shows the market it's real. It is real, and we know that just from who's buying the credits. But I think you get that investor buy-in when they feel that it's real, and I think probably people selling those credits is that going to be that moment. And base carbon is another one. There's a handful of these out there, and I think that when they start to produce free cash flow and show that not only can they create the credits but sell them, then the investor side of it kind of will, in my opinion, will become more interested, and then you'll see the price of these stocks, and there's 4 or 5 of them will pretty significantly rebound.
And when do you think you'll see that explosion, or not necessarily explosion, but when would you see that momentum really kicking
Well, the actual demand on the corporate side is there. Like, they're just factually, the big companies in the world are buying these credits and retiring. So that's actually happening. I think the market is so narrative driven. It's thematically driven, and so I can't quite call when it happens. But I think that the catalyst for it happening will be press releases from the various publicly traded carbon companies saying, "Hey, we're selling these credits now. We achieved this price," and I think that will really help turn the momentum in the market a little bit towards what they're doing. So I think it is happening on the one side. The market is happening, but it's the equity market that hasn't really said that they believe yet.
You're obviously an investor and a speculator. What have you been sort of focusing on the turn of this year? And where is your focus, or where are you focusing your attention for the rest of this year, whether that's commodities or particular jurisdictions?
Yeah, so I mean, at heart, I'm a sucker, right? So sometimes I like these really small cap. You can never put your whole net worth into these things. This is just for fun, but there was one that I've been buying. It's called U.S. Copper. USCN, I think is ticker. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the ticker. And they've got this huge historically operating copper mine in Northern California, and it's got a $5 million market cap or something like that. And to me, a story like that, with the copper narrative coming our way, deglobalization, the need for copper to be mined in North America, it's like that stock you could wake up with a multi-$100 million market cap. And so, there's another one I bought. What is Li3 lithium? So it's a lithium name, once again, like a $5 or $7 million market cap, and they have all these hard rock deposits in Zimbabwe. Well, the Chinese have been putting billions of dollars into Zimbabwe in mining, but in particular in lithium. And so, I like these stocks where you have a tiny market cap, you have this huge tailwind of copper or lithium, and you have the ability to go from 5 million to 200 million, in a matter of months. So those ones are really fun. But then you have others, like I can tell you, if the Fed doesn't change course here, gold seems like it's going to be interesting. But, for me, I just like to buy GDXJ, the ETF. and maybe that's because I don't know the gold names as well. But so for gold, for instance, I bought the GDXJ, but in these other spaces like copper, bought these kind of micro cappy stocks where a couple of things bounce your way, and the market cap can go from nothing to a huge number, right?
Yeah. Obviously, you're in nickel. How are you going to see the price of nickel over the course of this year, and what makes it? What kind of things influence the price in terms of it rising and obviously coming off? Because obviously all the battery metals are needed, and it's obviously common knowledge out there that all these battery metals are needed. What makes some of these battery metals price fluctuate?
Well, remember, almost all battery metals are really not battery metals in the first instance. Like copper is a proxy for GDP growth, and nickel, is steel industry, and so maybe with the exception of lithium, actually, the majority of these are really driven by some other industrial consumption, right? So, and that's true of nickel as well. I would say, though, setting aside that point, the big wild card for nickel, of course, is Indonesia and production in Indonesia and export bans. So I think that that's going to be really a driver of kind of the next 12 months for nickel pricing. Over the course of multiple years, you're going to have just a general environment where it's billions of dollars to make new nickel mines, and we haven't done it here for a couple of decades. But between now and then, the tape on China and China GDP growth, and that's gonna impact copper and nickel both, and then just what happens in Indonesia with new production.
And how do you see the economy developing as the year progresses? Obviously, you mentioned the Fed and all the things that they're up to. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is probably technically in a recession right now, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a big China reopening trade, just like we saw in the U.S. And that could be really complicated because it could accelerate inflation in the U.S. So I don't know for sure, but it feels like I think it's going to be a pretty good year, actually. I mean, I think the Fed is in a really tricky position around rate hikes. It's hard to predict what they're going to do, but I think it might not be driven by the Fed this year. It might be more driven by China and just reopening their economy and needing to stimulate there to kind of get everything restarted.
How are you finding, and I know you're not necessarily looking at finance, but how, from your perspective, how do you think the financing is of operations and projects and startups? Because it seemed to me towards the end of last year, things seem to be a little bit down, a little bit negative. But speaking to people this year, there seems to be a very positive attitude within the industry, and in terms of obviously raising money for projects and operations. How have you seen the market?
I think it's completely linked to the tape. So, if you have a gold tape here, the gold miners are all going to raise money, and I think it feels that generally speaking, because commodities do well in an inflationary environment, that a lot of these metals are going to have a tape to raise money this year if they want to. So it's very, just my observation is always that it's very fickle, and it'll open and close, and it's really going to be about the market's perception of those metals. So, like you said, we're not really in the market. It's not something we're interested in, but I just think that the market is generally more positive on commodity names based on where we're at with inflation.
Yeah. And if you were to pick a commodity for 2023, what commodity would you choose that you would see, I suppose, a great price hike in the share price of the commodity?
It's a tough one, but because of the cost of production of all of these base metals, right? Like it just acid costs more, labor costs more, and everything else, your bread is costing more. I kind of feel that all of these commodities should really be up 10 or 20% to reflect inflation, just to kind of break even. I think they should all be up. including gold, like just, what does it cost to produce an ounce of gold now? Like I remember when there were like $400 an ounce gold mines, and now like they probably can't break even under 1,400 or something. So
Yeah.
I just think that the price appreciation may be simply to like catching up to inflation. So that's where I see the kind of the year going.
Yeah. And sort of concluding, what's the outlook for nickel 28 this year? And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, so look, this year for us is all about getting through that final home tranche of the debt, and then preparing to pay dividend. Actually, just this morning we put out a press release, kind of instructing shareholders to the intention to return the capital, and that would be a material amount of capital if nickel price holds up. So, we're excited about it. I think the other thing that we're excited about is, Justin and I created a website called the Organ Group, where once every week or two, we kind of share our macro views and thoughts just with our investors. And so that's kind of a new thing we're doing. It's not so regular, but it's just, just kind of share people with how we're thinking about it. And that's the organgroup.com. So well, thanks again for having me, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I appreciate your time. And obviously we can include those details in the show notes as well. And if people want to reach out to you, how can they go about doing that?
I think Twitter's probably the easiest. You can just send me a message on Twitter.
Yeah, no worries. Well, appreciate your time, Anthony. Thank you again.
Thank you.
No doubt we'll speak later this year or later this year if anything's happening, obviously with nickel 28. And if you get that paid back early, then perhaps you want to come on and share your news.
Thank you.
No worries. Guys, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Please share this amongst the mining community, and even people outside the mining community, especially if they're looking to invest in commodities and maybe battery metals, so they can obviously understand what Anthony does. And like he said, he's got a separate show where he's obviously commentating on what his thoughts are in the industry. So appreciate your time, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.